Welcome back. This is a break in kind of the middle of the set of PowerPoints that are dealing with the Middle Ages, number 5, Mysticism and the Mystics. In the previous recording, we dealt with medieval mysticism itself, and in this recording, we're going to turn our attention to some of the mystics themselves and some of the theology of the mystics. And so with this rather less than smooth break, let's get back to this set of PowerPoints and the idea of the topic of medieval mystics. Just a list here of some notable mystics, again, mostly here just to get you to exposed to some of the names and briefly the ideas of these particular mystics. Excuse me. The first is Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard is one of the better known. In fact, in a course in philosophy I listened to, Hildegard was actually given more than just a nod. She was actually studied in some detail. Hildegard was a remarkable woman, a first in many fields at the time when few women were writing anything at all. She was known as the Sibyl of the Rhine, so you can see she comes from Germany, and produced major works of theology and visionary writings. When few women were accorded much respect at all, she was consulted by and advised bishops, popes, and kings. She was not only a theologian and something of a mystic, but she was something of an herbalist, a healer, and she used the curative powers of natural objects for healing. She wrote treatises on natural history and the medicinal uses of plants, animals, trees, and stones even. She was the first composer who wrote her own biography, and she founded a convent, and she even wrote music, which was performed, and some of which is still around. So a remarkable woman, remarkable person. She was the 10th child in a very large family, and she began having visions at a young age and was sent to an anchoress, Jutta of Sponheim, to live with her in a church in a Benedictine monastery. Now, an anchoress would be someone who was devoting her time to prayer and intercession for a church or people in community for others, and she would be supported by the people of that particular church. Hildegard spent her youth educating herself in Latin and other religious texts, and she became extremely well-versed. She also began experiencing visions where God would communicate to her. Upon reaching the age of 18, she received the status of nun. 20 years later, when she was 38, she succeeded Jutta as the Mother Superior of the convent of that church that she was attached to. Upon gaining the status of Mother Superior, Hildegard had a vision where God commanded her to spread the knowledge of her visions, and hence, with the assistance of a monk, she spent the next decade compiling and describing her dreams and provided an analysis of their interpretation of significance, and her work came under the notice of Pope Eugenius III, who gave her his approval. Around 1150, Hildegard moved to Bingen, on the banks of the Rhine River in Germany, where she even contributed the architectural content of the design of the convent that she was founding there. So add architect to all of her other achievements. She later founded another convent, Bingen, which was across the river from Bingen, where she had started the first monastery here, and her remaining years there, serving both of those monasteries, were very productive. As her notoriety spread, her convent at Bingen also grew, attracting nuns to live there and scholars and other mystics, so it became something of a school almost, educating as well as lifting the spiritual life up of everyone who came to live there. Her written works covered a variety of subjects, as I've already indicated: music, lyrics of songs, morality plays, works of devotion on theological subjects. She wrote an important biography of the saints that had preceded her. As I said, she wrote books on medicine and health, those books alone would have made her famous, at least in her day, in a time when the Middle Ages, when medicine was not much of a science, certainly not the kind of medical science that we would have appreciate today. But she wrote books on medicine that actually did help people at that time, as opposed to some of the other practices of medieval medicine. And anyway, she traveled around Europe, sharing her knowledge against the norms of the times of the day. She preached, and it is now thought that she suffered from migraine headaches, which may have been the physical cause of some of her visionary experiences. So were they really directly from God, or is there a physiological explanation for why she had these visions of God? The best-known writing of Hildegard of Bingen is a trilogy of works, including Civius, the Liber Vitae Meritorum, or Book of the Life of Merits, and the Liber Divinorum Operum, or the Book of Divine Works. What these works include are a number of her visions. Many are apocalyptic, but the visionary aspect aside, her sort of theological and spiritual explanation of these visions. So again, whether the visions were caused by headaches or whether they were real visions is often really beside the point, because her theological and spiritual insight into explaining these visions could basically stand on their own without reference to the visionary experience itself. So if you're inclined to think that the visions were real, well, that's one perspective. And if you're inclined to think that the visions had another course, her works can still be read with some profit in that respect. Another notable mystic is Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was a Dominican priest who lived in the Rhine region of Germany. The Dominicans were founded by Dominic, obviously in the 12th century, as you see there. Eckhart was born in 1260 in Hachheim, Thuringia, that is a town and region in Germany. He entered the Dominican order, as we've said. He received most of his education from the Studium Generale in the Cologne in Paris. That's a school, Cologne in Germany, rather. That's a school in Germany. In 1286, Eckhart went to Paris to study from 1294 to 1298. He was the prior of a convent of Erfurt, at the same time carrying on the office of vicar, which is an official church position in Thuringia. Eckhart was promoted to the Master of Theology in Paris in 1302 and taught as a professor there in the academic year 1202-03. So you can see that he was not somebody that was intellectual lightweight. He was a scholar. He also held a series of political offices, went back to Paris, then back to Cologne, then back to Strasbourg, and all the time when he was in these various political and academic offices, he was preaching. This preaching is what brought some accusations of errors and resulted in a papal bull or declaration in Agro Dominico from Pope John the 22nd, and we've heard of him before, issued on March the 27th, 1329, condemning 17 articles or 17 points in his preaching as heretical, and 11 more of the points of his preaching as suspect of heresy. Eckhart, however, did not live to see his condemnation. He died before the judgment was pronounced, probably in 1328. In 1329, his writings were condemned as heretical by the Pope, and he has been held in less than high esteem by many as a result of that. Attempting to summarize his mystical teaching is somewhat confusing. This knowledge of God that he was seeking demands a detached intellection, that is, a thinking without thinking, as it's described by his commentators, which views all of reality, as it were, from within the Godhead, seeing everything from the divine, transcendent divine point of view. Of course, we can't get to that divine point of view unless we are in contact with God somehow. We would say that's through the Bible. Eckhart and others, the mystics would say, was through their mystical experiences from the standpoint of divine subjectivity. So hence the mystical experience. The possibility for such knowledge lies in the gracious act of the Father, whereby he generates his word in the pure soul, and in this man is united with God. The union takes place in the ground of the soul, designated as the spark of the soul, scintilla anime, although properly it has no name, being free from all modes of as God himself is free. This spark is powerful good, and by virtue is a powerful good, and by virtue the soul resembles God. So you can see, read that over again, that's rather confusing. Many of Eckhart's works were filled with paradoxes. He refused to call God God and referred to him as deity, stating it's impossible to give God a finite definition. And at the same time, he mentioned God as a finite being, and that God cannot be defined as something absent or negative. So we've seen this in writers such as Pseudo-Dionysius before. This is that hyper sort of negative theology. Now, you can't say anything positive about God, so you have to say what God is not. So he's not weak. He's all powerful. He's not he's not finite. He's infinite. Basically, again, the language is confusing, but the attempt is to say that God is so far beyond us that anything we say about him is going to come up short. He stated that the true way for the soul to obtain salvation is by unity with God. Again, this union with God. Such knowledge is given in the traditional teachings of the church, but according to Eckhart, the way to attain to that unity with God does not necessarily agree with the formal teaching of the church. In other words, what the church says about God is true, but being true, the rights and the kinds of things that the church says you need to do in order to have contact with God, for him as a mystic, they all fall short. So again, as I've said, it's confusing. Eckhart argued that God manifested himself in all his beings, that everything real is truly God's being. This led to accusations of pantheism. So everything that is out there is all God. Everything is God. That sounds like pantheism. Whether he meant to say pantheism or not, again, is a question. Eckhart's teachings, main teachings, were based on the fact that he expected all souls to be internally connected to God and led by him. So there's the mystical element again. So there's some sense in which he's not trying to deny sort of things that are true about God that, say, the church was teaching or the previous theologians were teaching, but he's just saying you can't really claim then to have full knowledge of God unless you have this mystical experience. Another author, who we don't know, so we just say the author of this work, The Cloud of Unknowing, is another one of the famous mystics. The famous mystic work, Cloud of Unknowing, is an anonymous work, probably, most likely by an English Paris priest, written sometime after 1350, and is firmly in the tradition of Gregory of Nyssa, Pseudo-Dionysius. Again, we've seen this before. Here, God is known mainly only in a negative way, that we were just saying even about Eckhart, but maybe not quite as strangely as Eckhart was saying it. That is, God is not unloving, but love, not limited to one place, but omnipresent, not temporal and impermanent like man and all creation, but he is, again, unlimited, he's infinite, etc. The Cloud of Unknowing stresses how God is eternally hidden in a cloud of unknowing. That's the title of the work. Impenetrable to intellect, but, here's the key, accessible to love. So again, The Cloud of Unknowing, this 14th century anonymous work based upon the teachings of Pseudo-Dionysius and others, claim that God is so far above our knowledge, he's hidden in this cloud of unknowability. It's only by emptying the mind of all created images and the will of all temporal desires that we can arrive at the supremely earthly knowledge of God, knowledge that consists in knowing that we know nothing about God, that he infinitely transcends all of our apprehensions of him, and yet it's that recognizing that we can't grasp God by images or can't seek God by having our own earthly desires. We let all of those things go, that somehow we come to, again, an apprehension or knowledge or experience of him. Another notable Christian mystic, some people would question whether to put Thomas à Kempis in with this group, but we need to at least mention him because he's an important author. Thomas à Kempis, the author of The Imitation of Christ, is a devotional classic that's been translated into over 50 languages and has been around and still keeps being printed today. And I think even for us, it can be read with some profit. And little is known of Thomas himself. He's beyond this one contribution, this one book. He seems to be, frankly, a fairly minor figure. But this book made him, again, somewhat famous and for that reason important. The spiritual teaching of the imitation emphasizes withdrawal from the distractions and dangers of the world. That's good. It warns against placing confidence in one's own prudence and calls for knowledge of oneself, continuous self-judgment, and other traditional monastic virtues. Well, if we just understand that as we need humility in order to become more Christ-like, yeah, that's true. It's also critical of speculative theologizing, preferring study that inflames the heart with love for God. In other words, he says all of that scholastic study, and frankly, even some of those mystics, don't really get you there. You just need to read the Bible and seek God with a heart of love and desire to worship Him. The first book is a collection of spiritual meditations. The second and third books, The Heart of the Imitation, offer counsel on growth in virtues such as humility, patience, obedience, and on the fluctuations of the interior life. So that's usually that middle part of the book is where the most profit can be gained. The fourth book is devoted to the subject of Eucharistic piety, or how to make communion in the Catholic sense a more meaningful, even again mystical experience. That part might not be as helpful for us, but still a work you should be familiar with. One very well-known of these mystics is Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila, or Saint Teresa of Avila, was a Carmelite nun living in a Spanish convent in the 1500s. You can see we've taken a leap of a few hundred years here to get to Teresa. She entered the convent at the age of 20 after experiencing guilt about what she felt was an unhealthy interest in medieval fiction and her own appearance. So she, like a lot of teenage girls, was caught up in rather romantic literature and also a little vain. And so she thought, well, she needed to deal with that. And so she decided to enter a convent, which would be the best way to overcome these particular worldly influences. However, in the convent, she was frequently ill and never really had a life of robust health, and so she has become, in the Catholic tradition, a patron saint of sickness and sick people. Despite this frail health and great difficulties, she spent the rest of her life in the convent and also in Spain, establishing and nurturing more than 16 convents throughout Spain. So, like Hildegard, she turned out to be a very active and formidable person, even though her health might not have been the best. Her most famous work is titled The Interior Castle, in which she portrays the soul as if it were a castle with 7 dwelling places, each of which brings us to yet closer intimacy and union with God. This has some affinities with Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, because although this is somewhat a flowery sort of metaphor, I suppose, the interior castle, again, some of her insights there on prayer and other things, if we view them through the lens of spiritual formation, could be helpful. As we grow in contemplative prayer, we draw closer to the center wherein the experience of transforming union with God. Teresa's ascetic doctrine, which has been accepted as the classic exposition of the contemplative life, and her spiritual writings are among the most widely read. Her book, The Life of the Mother Teresa of Jesus, is autobiographical, and the Book of Foundations describes the establishment of her convents. Again, she is recognized as a writer of some very classic and useful spiritual, even mystic writings. The Way of Perfection, The Interior Castle, we mentioned, Spiritual Relations, Exclamations of a Soul to God, Contemplations of the Love of God. We can see that she was a prolific writer in this particular field. Well, to close out this particular lecture, I wanted to move from these particular instances of mystics to just give you a summary of mystical theology, since this is a course on historical theology, the background and subject writing of these mystics is interesting, but I wanted to sort of finish with this. This is an outline and notes taken from Dr. Sam Storms on mysticism, posted at his website. The mystics of the medieval church shared several common points of emphasis. First, they emphasized a spiritualizing and internalizing of the ideal of absolute poverty. Literal and physical deprivation evolved into more subtle forms of interior self-sacrifice. What that means is they accepted the regimen of monastic piety and material self-denial, periods of long prayer and contemplation, even foregoing meals, fasting, comfort, all designed to impoverish one's conscious sinful self by flooding the heart and mind with feeling of thoughts of Christ and God. The mystics of the medieval church shared several common points of emphasis. Again, secondly, they held to the belief that the religious realities confessed in faith can be experienced. The mystic ventures into a realm inaccessible to the normal processes of sensation and reasoning, go beyond the grasp of faith itself. Mystical theology found its knowledge of God in experiences beyond the reach of man's ordinary and cognitive and volitional powers. Now that's an important sentence there, so let me stop there. Mystical theology found its knowledge of God in experiences, so that's really the point about mystical theology. Not in books, not in arguments, not in reason like the scholastics, not in these long chains and extensive books of questions and answers and arguing over reason versus revelation and that sort of thing, but in these experiences. Excuse me. Hence the concern among mystical writers to designate a special faculty of the soul more profound than reason and will, something deep within the human soul that constantly reminds of its eternal origin, I should say, in God. So, by the way, you can see that Sam Storms is using Stephen Osmit's book, and I refer to Stephen Osmit's book again in putting these notes together. So that's the other source. Anyway, the point is that we see, hear, feel, taste, touch, smell. We have our senses, we have our reason. We can sort of figure things out inside. And the mystics said there's another faculty. There's a deeper faculty, an internal something in every one of us that if we can sort of access that faculty or that ability, that place within us, we would discover that that allows us to get to know God. Third, the principle of likeness. Being like God was for all the essential condition of this union with God. And with good reason. Mystical experience was considered a foretaste of the future. Again, think back to Dante Alighieri, getting to heaven and having that experience of the beatific vision. That's what we're all trying to get to. The mystics said, well, here's how you get there. Because man's eternal origin and goal, perfect oneness with God, gave content to the mystical way. Hence, the repeated stress by all mystical writers on withdrawal from the world, transcending reason, and retreating into the depths of one's being, where one is most like God. Again, the aim of the mystic is to abolish his finite and sinful individuality and to learn to think and feel and will as God does. Fourth, the threat posed to the Roman Catholic Church was that mystical theology and experience circumvented the need for the sacraments if one had this individual access to God, this individual capacity for God and knowing God and having a direct personal relationship with God, well, then you didn't really need all of the apparatus and rites of the Roman Catholic Church. Direct and immediate, unmediated access to God was contrary to the whole of medieval church life. Now, I want to pause here before I get to the end and say the Reformers didn't follow necessarily the thinking and the process of medieval mysticism or these mystics. They didn't just imitate the mystics in a sort of a new type of mysticism. But they did pick up on this one thing from mysticism, and that is that each of us has the capacity for a personal relationship with God. Again, I'm not saying that we should pursue that in the way that the mystics did, but the realization that each one of us is made in the image of God and has a capacity for to relate to God through Bible reading, through prayer, through, again, individually, but corporately through worship in the church means that we may not need and don't need all of the apparatus of the Roman Catholic Church in order to do that. We can take that too far and say, well, we all have access to God, we don't need one another. No, that's not true either, and that's where the mystics made a mistake in thinking that they could each individually do this on their own, because we all need the church together. But the idea that we don't need the rites and the sort of apparatus that the Roman Catholic Church was teaching in the Middle Ages is something that mystics can let us know about. Anyway, finishing this up, according to Philip Schaff, godliness in these men and women was not a system of careful definitions. It was a state of spiritual communion, not an elaborate construction of speculative thought, but a simple faith and walk with God, not processes of logic, but by the insight of devotion. The insight of devotion was their God. So you can see here, really the point is that those that are, the scholastics, the scholars, the medieval theologians that we talked about, as we talked about them, you can take that too far, thinking that all of our spiritual life is just talking about systematic theology and more doctrines and getting things really precise, point by point. That's not really the objective of communion with God and walking with God. Just because you have a systematic theology memorized doesn't mean that you have a deep relationship with God. On the other end of the spectrum, the mystics, I think we should say that they had another perspective that was right as well, but we don't need to go into these sort of visionary experiences or have necessarily the individual experiences of God, these deeper sort of profound sort of inexpressible experiences with God. I think some of what the scholastics, we do need doctrine, we do need to understand truth, we do need to have intellectual grasp of things, but that's not enough on its own. And this mysticism, this individual sort of, we all want a personal relationship with God, but that doesn't mean we throw out Bible study or serious contemplation of the truth of the Word of God as scholars. I think the point is that both of these extremes need to be sort of mediated by one another. So what the scholastics were striving in order to know God, and how they were doing that intellectually, and how the mystics are trying to get there just by their individual experiences, I think these are the extremes. And we need to understand that what Scripture teaches is something in between those extremes. Well, that's that finishes out. Let me get myself back up here. That finishes out the PowerPoints on medieval mysticism and mystics and mystical theology. And we'll be getting ready for the Reformation in the next lecture.